Hey, what's up everyone? I'm Evan with PodPeak, and in this video I'm going to give you the best simple advice you need before you start a podcast. Let's dive in. So at PodPeak, we offer creative audio solutions for podcasts, films, and brands. We work with small indie podcasts all the way up to bigger clients like REI. So if you're just getting into podcasting, or if you're just kind of wanting to up your podcast editing and production game, make sure and like this video, subscribe to our channel so you can get the content that we're going to be putting out. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you 3 simple pieces of advice that you really should think about before you start your podcast. And make sure that you watch this video all the way till the end, because I'm going to be dropping some bonus tips. Okay, so the first piece of advice, and this is extremely important, is you need to identify your niche. So the podcast business is booming. Like, more and more people are starting podcasts every week. The field's getting more and more crowded, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't start a podcast. A recent article from the New York Times basically said that more than half of the people in the United States listened to a podcast in 2019. And then it went on to say that 1 in 3 people in the US listen to at least one podcast every month. I mean, that's a lot of people. The podcast business is booming. You should get into it. And this is why finding your niche is so important. Like, you've got to be able to distinguish your podcast from everybody else's. So here's some things that you really should think about. Pick a topic that you're passionate about. Choose a podcast that you love. Do something that you enjoy doing every day. That's going to make sure that this is a much more enjoyable process for you. And it's also going to make sure that you don't burn out as easily. Another thing to think about is do research. See what other podcasts are out there that are related to the niche that you want to do. And again, just make sure that you can find a way to distinguish your podcast from everybody else's podcast. And the last thing to think about when you're talking about your niche, think about the people you know. Who are the people that you already know in this niche podcast that you want to start? Chances are you know people who are also into that subject. These people are going to be experts that you can talk to. They're going to be potentially compelling people that you can interview. They're also going to be people that you can collaborate with. Okay, so the second piece of advice is to choose a catchy, clever, and unique name. Now, I know that this might sound like easier said than done, but it's super important that you find a name that you can build your podcast off and potentially build a brand off of. One thing that might be helpful in coming up with a name is look at some of the other popular podcasts that are out there. Some names are more creative and more abstract, like the New York Times Rabbit Hole or Planet Money by NPR, while other podcasts are more literal and descriptive, like Around the NFL or American History Tellers. And finally, you can name your podcast after yourself, like the Joe Rogan Podcast. Just make sure whatever name you come up with, that it suits your style, and then it's going to be something that your audience is going to latch onto. Now, let's say you've chosen your name. So obviously the first thing you're going to want to do is search in Apple Podcasts to see if that podcast name's already been taken. If the name hasn't been taken, you should also see if the web domain's available, and you should get it. And maybe something else that you might want to check on is to see if the name you've chosen has been copyrighted or trademarked, because you never know in this day and age. The last thing you want is for your podcast to blow up and then somebody comes out and sues you because you took their name. So those are things you should check on. Okay, so the third and final piece of advice, and this is my favorite, is that you need to be able to tell somebody what your podcast is and what it's about in one compelling sentence. And a good exercise for this is to be able to say what the name of your podcast and then follow it with a podcast about. So let me give you an example. Back in 2016, I started my first podcast called The Fern Line. Now, The Fern Line is an outdoors podcast, specifically a mountain climbing podcast. Talk about niche, right? So once I came up with my name, I spent about a month just kind of figuring out what the tagline would be. And what I finally ended up coming up with is The Fern Line, a podcast about the lives of mountain climbers. Now, the reason why this has worked for me so well is because in the outdoors and the climbing world, there's a strong history and tradition of storytelling. People love hearing stories about adventure, close calls, triumphs, and sometimes even tragedy. But the other reason why my tagline works really well is because it doesn't limit me to just talking about people climbing mountains. It also gives me the opportunity to talk to people about their personal lives. in the mountains or outside of the mountains. And that's something that's worked really well for me. And that's why my tagline, a podcast about the lives of mountain climbers, works so well for the niche that I've chosen. So if you think this is an easy thing to do, then I would encourage you right now to go to a friend or a family member and tell them what your podcast is and what it's about in one compelling sentence, and then go a step further and ask them if it sounds interesting to them. At the very least, this is a really good exercise for you to do before you start your podcast, because it's really going to get you focused on what your podcast is about. And I can't emphasize enough how important that is. People start podcasts all the time. They don't have a focus. They're just talking about random things. And the reality is nobody cares about that. People want to listen to a quality podcast. They want to hear a podcast that's interesting, that has interesting people talking on it. And so the more focused you are, the more you understand going into it what your podcast is about, you're going to be way better off in the long run. All right, so I told you there was going to be a bonus tip at the end of the video, and here it is. So once you've decided on your podcast name, you've done your research, you figured out that nobody has that podcast, even if you're not going to start the podcast right away, I would encourage you to get all of the social media outlets locked down for that podcast name. For instance, get your Facebook handle, get your Instagram handle, get your Twitter handle. Make sure that you have that name secured on social media so that down the road, if you want to build that podcast and brand it on social media, you're going to make sure that you're going to be able to do that because you secured the names for your podcast on social media. All right, well, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like it and please subscribe to the channel. And if you have questions or comments, please leave a comment below, and I'll talk to you soon.